Hello, welcome to Photo School. This is part 1 of the basic photography tutorial, and part 1 is about exposure. How you can use aperture, shutter speed and ISO value to properly expose your photos. I will explain what these things are and how you can use them to make better photos, because everyone can learn photography. Watch all my videos to really learn photography. I hope you will enjoy this video and the others. I hope you will take the time to give it a thumbs up or subscribe to my channel below. That would be really appreciated. And if you give comments, that can help me to make better videos for you. So enjoy the video and see you back soon.
To properly expose a photo, just enough light must fall on the camera sensor. Too much light will result in an overexposed photo, and too little light will result in an underexposed photo that is too dark. To ensure that a photo is properly exposed, you need 3 things that you can influence yourself. The first is the aperture. The aperture is like a window through which the camera looks out. With a large window a lot of light comes in, and with a small one, little light comes in. The camera has the option to change the aperture from very large to very small and thus adjust the exposure. Secondly, there is the shutter speed, which is the time at which the light falls on the camera sensor. If this is a short time, little light falls on the sensor, and if this is a long time, a lot of light falls on the sensor. A camera has the option to set this from very long, for example 3 seconds, to very short, for example 1/4000th of a second. You can influence the exposure of the photo with the shutter speed. Thirdly, there is the camera sensor's sensitivity to light, the ISO value. You can set this from very low ISO values, where the sensor needs a lot of light, but you can also set a high ISO value where the sensor needs little light to expose correctly. A large and a small aperture, a short and a long shutter speed, and a high and a low ISO value, all have certain advantages and disadvantages that we will discuss later in this video, but we will also go into more detail in the videos part 2, 3 and 4. There are blades in the lens of the camera. These blades can make the aperture larger and smaller. You can see that very clearly demonstrated in these images. Here is a schematic image of a series of apertures from 1.8 to 16. The larger the aperture, the smaller the number, and the smaller the aperture, the larger the number. For example, you see a large opening at aperture 1.8, and a very small opening at aperture value 16. So a low number at the aperture value means a large opening, and so a lot of light reaches the camera sensor. With a high number, there is a small opening and less light reaches the camera sensor. Shutter speed is the time that the camera shutter is open to let light hit the sensor. Here you see a schematic view of a series of shutter speeds, from long, 1/4 of a second, to short, 1/500th of a second. The longer the shutter speed, the more light can fall on the camera sensor, and the brighter the photo becomes. With a fast shutter speed, little light falls on the camera sensor, and the photo becomes darker. If you photograph something that is moving quickly, the movement will be blurred at a slow shutter speed, and therefore the resulting image will not be sharp, and at a fast shutter speed the movement will be frozen and result in a sharp image. Because you can never hold the hands with which you hold the camera completely still, you can see that movement of your hands in the photo at slow shutter speeds, as motion blur. The photo then becomes blurry, because you noticeably move, or better shake, the camera at slower shutter speeds. Here you see an example of a photo with a slow shutter speed. You can see motion blur of the subject in the photo. In this photo, you can see that even the movement of the very fast rotating propeller is frozen by a very fast shutter speed. The ISO value is the degree to which the camera sensor is sensitive to light. You could say that most cameras have an ISO value of 100 by default. A value of ISO 100 requires twice as much light for a properly exposed photo as a value of ISO 200. The sensor converts the incident light into an electronic signal. To get a sensitivity of 200 ISO, the camera has to amplify the signal. Compare that with the amplifier of your stereo system. If you turn it very loud and amplify the signal a lot, there will be more and more noises and crackles. This also happens in the camera when amplifying the light signal. By increasing the ISO value, noise is created. So you get a lighter photo with less light, but you also get more digital noise. If you list those things that determine the exposure in the camera, they are the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO value. With a large aperture, and therefore a small number, for example 2.8, a lot of light reaches the sensor, but the depth of field is less. Depth of field is the area that is in focus in front of and behind the in-focus plane. In this example photo, you can see the depth of field in the sharply depicted grass very well. And also the parts that lie in front and behind that are blurred. The larger the aperture, the smaller the depth of field, and the smaller the aperture, the larger the depth of field. We will go into this in more detail in a next video. Furthermore, a large aperture provides a lot of light and a small aperture for less light on the sensor. A large aperture, for example 2.0 or 2.8, can be used in low light, such as dark weather or indoors. You can use a small aperture, of 11 or 16 when there is a lot of light, for example on a sunny day at the beach or in the snow. You know by now, that a slow shutter speed, produces a lighter photo, but motion blur if you photograph something that is moving quickly. A fast shutter speed gives less light in the photo, but you can freeze fast moving subjects. The ISO value ensures that more light is needed at a low value and less light at a high value for a well-exposed photo. But at a higher ISO value you have more problems with noise. High ISO values come in handy if you want to shoot in dark conditions, such as indoors or at dusk or at night. You can use a low ISO value when there is a lot of light, such as in sunny weather.
In this part of the video I'm going to show you in real time the influence of aperture, shutter speed and ISO value on your image. At this moment the image is exposed at 1/50th of a second, an aperture of 8.0 and an ISO value of 400, and it is properly exposed. The focus is on the nose of the middle figurine. The background is not sharp, it is blurred, and only the three middle figurines are more or less sharp. We've dialed back the aperture to 16. The image has become much darker, but the background is now sharp. If we're going to dial back the image to f11, you see that there is a little bit more light and there is somewhat of blurring in the background. If we come back to f8.0, you get to the original image. It's properly exposed, a blurred background and a sharp middle figurine. Dialing back further to 5.6, you see that the image becomes overexposed, the background is even more blurred, but there is still a lot of detail. Dialing back to f4.0, there's a lot of overexposure and even more blurry background. If we dial back to 2.8, there's a strong overexposure, lots of detail has gone lost, and the background is very blurry. If we dial back to 2.0, lots of detail is lost and a very blurry background. And if you go back to 1.2, most of the detail is lost and the background is very blurry. So here you see in real time what the aperture does with your image. We've dialed back the aperture to 8.0, and this time we're going to change the shutter speed. We begin at 1/8 of a second. You see that the image is really overexposed. 1/20th of a second gives a lot of detail, but it's still slightly overexposed. The same at 1/40, it's properly exposed. At 1/80th of a second it is becoming dark. At 1/250 it's really dark. 1/500th of a second is even darker. And if we go to 1,000th of a second, you see that the image has become really dark. We are back at 1/50th of a second, aperture 8.0 and ISO 400, but now we're going to dial back the ISO to 100. At 100 you see that the image has become too dark. When we set the ISO to 200, the image is still a little bit dark, and back to 400 the image is properly exposed. Now we're going to ISO 800 and the image is clearly overexposed. At ISO 600 this becomes even clearer, and at ISO 3200, lots of detail has gone lost. If we go back up to 6400, most of the detail is lost and the image is really overexposed. So we have come to the end of part 1 in the basic photography tutorial. I hope you have learned how to properly expose your photos using aperture, shutter speed and ISO value. Once again, a thumbs up, subscribing to my channel, and comments are really appreciated. Comments can help me make better videos, and I hope you will watch the other videos in this series also. So, goodbye.